Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and welcome to the first episode in my Great Guitar Build-Off 2021 series. I'm going to begin here by just preparing some of the wood that I'm going to be using for this build. And first up, I'm going to be jointing the edges to glue up the top, and this top is Macassar Ebony. A really interesting piece of ebony I just kind of stumbled across online. Just testing how the pieces fit together. Not quite done yet, so I'll run that piece through again. And now they look good. Not quite. Now they look good. So once I'm done with that, I'm going to move on to the three pieces for the rest of the body, and this is going to be some swamp ash. I'm doing fairly shallow passes with my jointer. I don't want it to remove too much material, because that could mess up the book matching of the top a little bit, and I also don't want to remove too much material from the pieces of the body. Right, so now moving on to the neck blank. This is a piece of roasted flame maple. And really all I'm doing running this over the jointer is trying to square up one edge, which is going to make it easier for me to route the truss rod channel in a little bit. And you can tell from those first couple of passes that this was sort of a concave edge because it was only removing material at each end, but that last pass went all the way across. So now that I'm done with the jointer, I'm going to begin gluing up the pieces for the body. It's got an old gift card here that I've cut some notches into that I'm using as a glue spreader. And I've oriented the pieces in such a way that the grain from them lines up as closely as I can get it to. You can see a few of those grain lines match up pretty nicely. I mean, nobody's ever going to look at this and think it was just one piece of swamp ash, but I got it as close as I could. You can see there, as soon as I put on pressure, one of those boards tried to slip out. I'm going to push it back in place, and I'm going to add a couple of clamps on the edges here to make sure it doesn't slide like that again. I'm putting very little pressure on these clamps because I don't want them to, get in the way of the other clamping going on, but all I really need them to do is stop the boards from slipping. So for the top, I decided to go with a taping glue method rather than clamps. You can see some cracks in the board there, and I was a little bit concerned that if I put clamping pressure on it, it might cause those cracks to shift or possibly split in a weird way that would have been a problem. So I decided to go with tape instead. It still gets a pretty good glue joint, and even after I got the tape on there and it looked pretty good, I still added a couple of quick clamps with just a little bit of pressure on them to tighten it up a little bit more. It's okay, nobody saw that glue spill on the floor. It's fine. Like I mentioned earlier, I squared up one edge of the neck blank so that I could use this guide fence to do the routing for the truss rod channel. I do this routing taking several shallow passes of maybe 1 or 2 millimeters at a time. And then once I've routed to the appropriate depth, I'm going to go in with the chisel and square up the ends, because the ends of the truss rod itself have some square metal bits on them that won't fit all the way down in the round bottom channel that the router bit has created. And just doing a test fit, and it looks good. So now that the truss rod channel is in, I no longer need the neck blank to be square. So I'm going to start by cutting away cutting in the headstock break angle. Now, when I do a headstock break angle, I never have a specific angle in mind that I'm trying to get. I usually just work with whatever the piece of wood will give me. So in this case, I know my headstocks, I usually want them about 1/2 inch or maybe 15 millimeters thick, so I've marked out the appropriate angle that I need to cut on here in order for the minimum thickness to be 15 millimeters. And you can also kind of see there I've marked out the whole neck profile, I suppose, on the side there so that I can cut the whole thing right now. Now just carefully making these cuts, trying to stay a little bit outside the line, just so that I've got a little bit extra material there. It's going to mean removing more later, but I figure that's better than accidentally ruining this neck blank now. And once I've got the first part cut, I'm going to go and cut in the neck taper. Just a really beautifully flamed piece of maple. So I'm going over here, I'm going to use a saw rasp just to level off the face of the headstock. Some people might wonder why I don't use a hand plane for this, and the reason is I only have a couple of hand planes, and I think all of them are older than I am right now, and they probably haven't seen any sort of maintenance since before I was born, and they're just really not well suited for any type of work right now. Keep meaning to find the time to clean them up and sharpen them, but I just haven't found the time for it yet. And once I've got the top of that flat, I can draw on the shape for my headstock. I did that from a template that I created the last time I made this particular design. So just going back to the bandsaw once again to cut this out. And certainly this would be easier if I had swapped out my bandsaw blade to the narrower one, but I'm a little bit lazy for that, and there are also some cuts coming up later where I want a thicker resawing blade. Well, that's not really a big deal at this point, it just means I'm going to have to do a little bit more shaping on the spindle sander rather than doing all of it on the bandsaw. I've got the shape roughly cut in, and taking one of the offcuts from the headstock and making a couple smaller pieces out of it. And I'm going to be using these to add a little bit material on the sides of the headstock because the original piece of wood wasn't quite wide enough. Now luckily the way this came out, these extra pieces that I'm gluing on won't have the actual tuning keys in them, so there's no real structural importance to these extra pieces. They're entirely aesthetic. And of course, because of the kind of odd shapes that I'm working with here, I'm using tape to hold them in place rather than clamps. So once that glue is dry, back to the bandsaw yet again, and I'm going to remove that extra material. And now, like I mentioned, I'm going over to the spindle sander, and I'm going to do a little bit more work on the neck taper up by the headstock because some of the extra headstock material was sort of in the way for that earlier. And then I'm also going to clean up the shape of the headstock a bit. Notice whenever I'm doing something pointy, I also like to round over the points just a little bit. Makes them a little bit less likely to chip, I found. And also, nobody really wants them to be that pointy. And once all that's done, I'm going to go back in with my small random orbital sander and just smooth out the top, get all the remaining glue off of it, and get it all level. That's done. I've got a spot marked out where I'm going to begin drilling for truss rod access. I like to do this before the truss rod is put in because I just really don't like the idea of my drill bit running into the end of the truss rod. That's really about the whole reason I do this now instead of later. One of these days I'll actually get around to making a truss rod a router template to route out most of this truss rod access, but I haven't done that yet. For now, still using the drill. And of course I had to switch to a longer drill bit, so that the drill itself wasn't running into the headstock and marking it up. Not that it'll matter too much, there's going to be a face on the headstock here, so any marks left on the front of it now aren't going to matter. Now that I've got the truss rod access in, I'm ready to glue on the fretboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in the truss rod, put a piece of tape over it, because I don't want any glue getting into the truss rod channel if I can avoid it. And I'm just going to bring in a knife, cut away the excess tape. I'm going to apply my glue. And lately I've begun removing the tape before I actually put the truss rod on. I find it just makes the glue up a little bit easier. I found that in the past, if I leave the tape on, the extra thickness of the tape in the middle can mess with the glue joint of the fretboard a little bit. Either that or just make clamping a bit more difficult, because it seems like the fretboard wants to wobble on top of the neck, just because that extra material is there. And I'm just putting on a big old block of Wenge. It's an offcut from the Doom Eternal guitar I made last year. I'll throw up a link on the screen if you're interested in that build. It's something quite interesting and different from what I normally do. But here I'm just using that offcut as a nice big flat clamping caul for the fretboard. And I'm not too concerned about the clamps touching the back of the neck, since a lot of carving still needs to happen on the neck. Any marks that those clamps leave on there now are going to come out later. But this brings us to the end of the first video. I hope you enjoyed it. Some social media links there on the screen and a Discord server link in the description. It's a place where you can come in, talk about guitars, whether they're mine, yours, somebody else's, music, funny guitar jokes, things like that. Feel free to join. It's a fairly new server, so there's not too many people in there right now. But yeah, that is the end of this video, and I hope to see you around for the next one.